We good?
We're good.
All right, please start recording.
It's recording.
Thank you. Allison?
Good morning and welcome. My name is Allison Lynch. I'm co-chair of Mission Advancement for ULI Los Angeles. And on behalf of the Advisory Board for Los Angeles, I'm happy to welcome you to this morning's session. This is the third webinar in a series that we did that reflected on the state of our city post-pandemic. We started in early April with this discussion of the industry and what was happening. We moved on to envisioning healthy cities. Today's program, State of the City, Real Estate and Land Use Policies that have divided Los Angeles, was designed specifically to give us a perspective lens into discussing the challenging issues of our time that are focused around social equity. All of the sessions have aligned with ULI Los Angeles' strategic pillar, which are to convene, engage, include, grow, and share. The goal is that with today's program, that the context that you learn today will influence the work that you do every day in working in the land use arena and align with the mission of ULI, which is to create sustaining and thriving communities. Events like this are only possible due to the time and passion of the panelists who put their effort and time into speaking to you today. And as I learned today, the continuous tireless efforts of the staff of ULI to work with the technology that we are using to put these panels together in the virtual world. And I thank them for that. We also thank our annual sponsors who make all programs possible. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Cerise Griffith, who will kick off today's program. Thanks, Cerise.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We're having a bit of a technical difficulty for a second. Please be patient with me. Good morning and welcome. My name is Cerise Griffith and I'm the Senior Director for ULI Los Angeles. We're very pleased that you could all join us today. Before we begin, we have a few thank yous to share with everyone and some tips for maximizing your Zoom experience today. I first want to say that we're grateful for our sponsors and for the support that they have given to us throughout the year. Our sponsors are critical to the quality programming that provides value to ULI membership. I also want to thank my fellow ULI team members, Marty, Lisa, Sophie, and also Allison, our Chair of Mission Advancement, for her part in bringing this panel and program together. Now we have just a few Zoom tips for everyone. We find that if you turn off your video and place yourselves on mute and place the screen in speaker format so that only the panelists are visible, it makes for a better Zoom experience. Also, we ask you to take a moment to look at the chat function in your Zoom box at the base of the Zoom screen. This is important this morning because in the interest of maximizing our time, we hope that you will put your questions into the chat section and address the speaker you wish to address the question to, and then the question. Who would have thought a year ago that our lives and our workplaces would have been so changed? That a global pandemic would have taken the lives of 200,000 fellow Americans and 1 million people worldwide? That the capture on video of the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and too many would catalyze hundreds of protests around the world. That we all would be looking at issues of systemic racism and that it would become a topic of national dialogue. Or even that the Urban Land Institute would be among thousands of institutions making conscious pivots from valuing inclusion to taking wide-scale actions towards improved diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. Who would have thought also that the real estate industry and land use industry would be looking at the role of advancing how systemic racism has changed our lives? Historic context is very important. The Urban Land Institute is the oldest and network of real estate and land use experts of the world. Our councils and our member collective carry out a mission to provide leadership in the responsible use of land and in leadership in creating sustainable, thriving communities. With today's panel, we'll dive into the historic context of equity in real estate. I have the honor of introducing our moderator for this morning. Effie Turnbull is a passionate and dedicated advocate for economic and environmental and social change. She currently serves as the Vice President of Civic Engagement and Economic Partnerships at the University of Southern California. Effie?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Cerise. I really appreciate the introduction and the framing of the very important conversation that we'll be engaged in this morning. I'm really pleased to be here with everyone today and grateful to the ULI team for the opportunity to discuss this critical subject at this very important time. Thanks to Marty, again, Cerise, Kevin, and Allison, Allison, for putting this together. Today's focus is real estate and land use policies that have divided Los Angeles, and we will be focusing on both a historic context and also I'm very excited to talk about our path forward. This is a subject, as Cerise mentioned, is critically important at this moment in history and perhaps than it has ever been before as we grapple with this country's very rich and beautiful, but also terribly unjust past that has devastated so many communities and in some cases almost completely wiped them out. You see that with the inception of this country with genocidal acts committed against Native Americans and carried out in California with laws that prohibited Chinese Americans from owning land, that interned Japanese Americans and prohibited, in some cases, land ownership and loss of property. You see that with the use of eminent domain in Chavez Ravine. You see that with the urban renewal programs that went through the point of least resistance and plowed through communities like the 10 freeway through Latinx communities in the East Side and through African American communities in Sugar Hill and in Santa Monica. And we've seen our country's worst cases of challenges around race as highlighted with the Black Lives Matter movement, ending in the murder and lives being literally snatched away by the hands of the state. And we see that with police violence, but also with the violence acts of robbing millions of Americans and Angelenos for hundreds of years and into the present of opportunities for economic advancement, educational and employment opportunities, and particularly the opportunity to build wealth through home ownership or through owning commercial real estate and building businesses. And limited ownership opportunities have had tremendously devastating effects on our economy and is creating a permanent underclass where people of color are at the bottom. And right now, not only is Los Angeles, but America is not living up to the basic social contract that we subscribe to. That if you work hard, you play by the rules, you get ahead. That classic Horatio Alger story, rags to riches, is not possible for so many, in part because of the history and now continuing government-backed discrimination. And racist land use policies that put one race at the advantage of others, and the continuation of these policies with very sophisticated and current practices that still have the same effect, which we're going to be unpacking this morning. That and the lack of remedies for past wrongs is extremely challenging. And I think we all can agree that the current system is broken. It's on a shoddy foundation, and if we don't do something about it, more immediately, we risk forever losing this battle in our country for living up to these ideas of justice and equality. And I'm really excited today to talk about and help facilitate a conversation, not only about the history of these challenges around inequality and land use practices, but to hear from experts about solutions and what we can do now on a going forward basis and how you all can work to assist in these efforts. And with that, I'm going to jump into the Q&A for this panel. And we have, today we're going to have Dr. Paul Ong, Dr. Richard Green, Michael Anderson, and Rudy Espinoza. And I believe we'll be sharing some of the bios in the chat and or separately via email. Dr. Ong, I'm going to turn to you. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, we're so glad to have you here. I have read a number of items that you have written. I really have enjoyed your work, South Los Angeles since the 1960s, race and place, and you can talk a little bit more about the full title. I think it's a seminal piece that I've used with teams in the past to help understand inequality in South Los Angeles, and I was hoping that you could help us frame our discussion, starting with a definition, and that is, what is systematic inequality and racism in land use and real estate, and how has it historically and currently impacted the Los Angeles region?
Very important question, a very difficult question to answer. I'm going to borrow heavily from our book, Uneven Urbanscape, to define these things. But before I do that, I want to thank my staff at the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge, as well as our partners at the Latino Policy and Politics Institute, the Ziman Center for Real Estate, and the Institute on Inequality and Democracy. Next slide. So one of the ways we think about systemic inequality is a system of interlocking processes that produces disparities across multiple arenas and reproduces stratification over generations. It involves explicit and implicit biases in individuals, groups, institutions, and the economy. And race and class are the two fundamental divides that we're most concerned about. There are clearly other divisions along gender lines and so forth. But for this talk, it's really around race and class. The challenge is trying to understand these processes in a causal fashion if we want to influence policies. And in particular now, today, we want to know how it's occurring during the pandemic. And so much of our research over the last 6 months has been trying to understand the patterns and magnitudes of this systemic inequality being reproduced during the COVID-19 crisis. Next slide. So we looked at a number of different things: the labor market, the housing market, sustainability, and so forth. But for today's talk, really it is around the housing market. And so we see, for example, during the pandemic, that the percentage of different populations that are unable to pay rent are systematically different. And you can see that on the chart on the left. And Blacks and Hispanics in particular are disadvantaged in terms of not being able to pay rent. And we also see the class differences on the right. And these differences are due to both the direct impact of the pandemic in terms of creating unemployment and displacement, but there are other factors that also are producing these inequalities, such as historical lack of assets, resources, and the lack of ability to access assistance. Next slide. And this gets played out in terms of neighborhood. It gets spatialized. And so this is a map of Los Angeles. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this region. And the populations in the neighborhoods most vulnerable to the rent crisis that's coming up is not surprisingly in the core of the urban areas and the eastern part of the San Fernando Valley. And these are areas that historically been underinvested, disinvested. These are areas where there are poor schools, there's poor health facilities. It's a compounding of these sort of effects. Next slide. And we also see this pattern, not just in the rental market, but we're seeing a potential crisis also in home ownership. And the number and proportion of people who are not able to pay the mortgage during the pandemic is surprisingly high. In absolute number, it's actually much higher than the total number of foreclosure during the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis. And again, if you look on the right, it is really played out in terms of how the pandemic has affected different groups. You could see that whether we're talking about whether it's a household that lost earnings because of the pandemic or households that did not lose earnings during the pandemic. The pandemic is very uneven in terms of its economic and employment impact. But what we see is that in both of those types of households, there are clear racial differences in terms of people of color struggling much more to try to meet the mortgage payment. And both the rental crisis and the mortgage crisis points to a potential wave of dislocation and maybe homelessness, because by the end of this year, these households would have accumulated huge debts that they would have to pay. Next slide. And so, again, we have done a number of analyses. I'm very thankful to our partners who've been working with us to track in real time as possible the impact of the pandemic. You're welcome to visit our site. We think we now currently have 17 different analyses in terms of how the pandemic is affecting Los Angeles, California, and the nation. That's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ong. I really appreciate that overview and looking at those stark inequalities that you highlighted in your slides. Thank you for that. I'm now going to turn to Dr. Richard Green. Richard, we have two questions for you. We'll see if we can get through both of them. The first question is, how are you this morning? Good morning.
Richard, you're on mute.
Yeah, you would think after 6 months of doing this every day, I would remember to unmute myself. Good morning, Effie. I'm good, and it's good to see you.
Great to see you as well. Richard, can you elaborate on this concept of disparate impact and how apparently race-neutral land use policies can actually have a negative impact on communities based on race? And I think this was illustrated, the history and the impacts of this are illustrated in Paul's prior slides, where you see those impacts bearing out in the statistics.
Well, so two things. One is there have been policies that have not been disparate impact policies. They've just been plain old racist policies. And I hope I can talk about that a little bit. Yes. But when we're talking about disparate impact, we're talking about policies that on their face appear to be race neutral, but in fact they are not. So I'll give an example of this. The use of FICO scores to determine who gets a home mortgage or not appears on its face to be a race neutral policy, because after all, your FICO is what your FICO is. And FICOs actually do a pretty good job of predicting whether they repay their debts or not. The problem is the US has a bunch of people who are called credit invisibles, 40 million Americans, who have no FICO scores at all. Now, this does not mean that they are bad credit risks. It doesn't mean that they're good credit risks. It means that we don't know a lot about their credit characteristics, in part because they use cash to do pretty much everything they do, or write checks. And what we know is the average credit invisible is actually a pretty good credit risk. We don't know what an individual credit invisible is, but on average, they're pretty good. So if we knew who was an average person among those who don't have a FICO score, we could actually very safely give them access to credit. Who are the people who are credit invisibles? They're disproportionately people of color, immigrants, and older folks. And so here is a policy that basically makes it difficult for certain groups to get mortgages, appears to be race neutral, but is not. One quick other example, debt to income ratio under cutoffs for mortgage lending that says that if your debt to income is higher than a certain amount, you just can't get a mortgage. Well, the thing is, how is income counted? Lenders discount contractor income relative to salary income when they make these decisions. Who's more likely to have contract income? People of color, immigrants. So their income is not counted equally to non-Hispanic white income on average. So again, here you appear to have something that's race neutral, but has very important effects, disparate impacts across different races, and where we could do better. You need to unmute Effie.
Unmute Effie.
Got it. I got it. It just took a second. I think that is the saying of the day. You need to unmute yourself. The second question, Richard, I think really goes into the history of redlining and urban renewal. So thank you for highlighting how these current policies are not addressing these issues around the credit invisibles and do very little to ameliorate past state sanctioned discrimination and could actually exacerbate existing inequality. And as we keep this in mind in terms of history and current times, I'd like to ask, how does the history of redlining and urban renewal of the 1950s and the after effects of the residential mortgage crisis of 2008, coupled with the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, how does that affect how has that affected home ownership and wealth building in disadvantaged communities?
All very badly. I'd like to start by talking about quickly two papers. One was a PhD dissertation written at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the late 90s, where I was on the faculty for many years, by a woman named Kate Antonovics. She's now a professor at UC San Diego. And she does the following simulation. Imagine we were in a world where we really were in a race-neutral world now. No more discrimination. Everybody's heart, mind, et cetera, is in the right place. How long would it take to get rough wealth and income inequality across different racial and ethnic groups? The answer is more than 200 years. How wealthy, how affluent your parents are matters a lot to how wealthy and affluent you are going to be. And that gets at a second point paper by, gosh, I'm blanking on his name, Erickson at the University of Cincinnati. I'm trying to remember his first name now. Where he shows the number one predictor of whether somebody is a homeowner is whether their parents are homeowners. More important than parents' income, more important than parents' education, more important than parents' other wealth, like stock market wealth. All those things are really important. But it is that fact that you grew up as a homeowner that makes you more likely to be a homeowner. And so policies from nearly 100 years ago still matter in terms of the patterns we see in ownership. All right, so a little history. This map is a map, or a redlining map of Los Angeles from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. It's a 1939 map. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation was invented by the federal government. It was a New Deal program, not to help people buy houses, but to help people stay in their houses because they were in trouble. So entering the Great Depression, most people's mortgages were had bullet payments. Basically, they had 3 or 5 year terms, and then you had to refinance them. And so what happened was the Great Depression comes along, and it's impossible to get a refinance. Even if you have a job, it's impossible to get a refinance because nobody wants to finance those loans. And so a program was invented called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, whose purpose was to buy loans that were in default from the financial institutions that had issued them at a small discount so that the financial institution wasn't held harmless, but at the same time wouldn't go out of business. And then recast those loans as self-amortizing 15-year fixed rate mortgages. And that was sort of the beginning of the fixed rate mortgage being part and parcel of the mortgage system. We had them before, but they weren't ubiquitous. All right. Now, to be eligible to get one of these mortgages, you needed to be in a green area. And so every major American city had a redlining map. So if you look, the blue and the green, those were areas where you could participate in these programs. And green was particularly easy. So that's why we call it green lining, when it's fairly easy to get a loan. If you were in the red or brown area, it was very difficult to get in one of these. And in fact, if you were in the red area, it was pretty much impossible to get one of these. And you can see where the red areas of Los Angeles were back in the late 1930s. All right, so what this meant was that if you were having trouble getting your loan refinanced and you were white, you got your loan refinanced, you got to keep your house. If you were black, it meant you didn't, which meant you didn't get to keep your house. So we had a generation of people who were homeowners who lost their homes just because of the color of their skin or the neighborhood, the ethnic and racial composition of the neighborhood they lived in. All right, let's fast forward to, and I could talk about things that happened in between, but let's fast forward to the first decade of the 20th century. And we have subprime mortgages, predatory lending. And we know now 2 things about that business. The first is that there were lots of African Americans who were eligible for the best quality credit, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac loans. So the way to look at it, it's the cheapest credit. But were convinced to take on subprime loans. Loans that had low initial payments, but that would blow up later. So loans that were negative amortization loans, loans that were had teaser rates. And you could say, well, it was people's own responsibility to know these things, but mortgages are complicated products, and we can talk more about that if you like. And the fact is very, very, very few people understand their mortgage. They basically, what they understand is their first payment that they make on the mortgage. Beyond that, they don't understand very much. So you had disproportionately people of color being saddled with these toxic products, which thankfully, because of Dodd-Frank, are basically out of the market right now. But again, it caused them to disproportionately lose their houses through the global financial crisis. Now, here we are in the time of COVID. It is the best time to buy a house in years because of how low interest rates are. Even in Los Angeles, if you can get, I've had my students work on this, if you can get access to a mortgage, it's cheaper to own in Los Angeles right now than it is to rent in Los Angeles. And the reason I know this, we look at individual condos that both are for sale and for rent, and we compare the rent to what it would cost you to own that condo given 3% mortgage rates. It's cheaper in many parts of Los Angeles to own than it is to rent. But what you need in order to get a mortgage, you need a job. And who has disproportionately been affected by the unemployment crisis? Professor Ong showed us this. It's people of color. So again, it's like lather, rinse, repeat. We see these opportunities to keep your house or to obtain a house. And over and over and over again, we see people of color not be able to take advantage of these opportunities. Next slide, Cerise. And so we get this. This is based on 2017 home ownership data, the home ownership gap between African Americans and non-Hispanic whites in 2017 was 27%, and we're working on the 2018 data right now to update it. It's not going to change very much. Okay, 10% of that you can explain just with economics. How old are you? How much money do you make? How well educated are you? What city do you live in? And so on. 17% is quote unquote unexplained, which is to say you look at a household and you look at them and you say, why are they not homeowners? Well, it's this history, this access to credit that explains the difference.
Unmute, Effie.
Thank you for that, Richard. I think we're making good time, so I think we have an opportunity to do kind of a little bit more of a follow-up question for you again on issues around the push out. You know, we've talked about what's happening to people of color in Los Angeles and in similar cities. What do these opportunities in Los Angeles look like for people of color, and are there social and environmental consequences? Some folks are, I'm hearing conversations, and we're hearing conversations around folks feeling like they are being pushed out of Los Angeles because of the lack of affordability. Can you touch on that, Richard?
Sure, and it's not just folks talking about it, which I'm a data nerd, so folks talking about things are not enough to convince me of much of anything. We're observing it. If you look at the African American population in Los Angeles County, it as a share of population is, I think at its peak was 12-13%. It's now 7-8%. So I mean, it's happened. There's no dispute that it's happened. But it's not just in Los Angeles. If we look at what I will call what have been our high opportunity cities, Seattle, the Bay Area, Boston, New York, Washington, DC. In these places, we have in fact seen affluent people move into these cities. Non-Hispanic whites move into these cities. People with college degrees moving into these cities, and they are in fact pushing out other groups that don't fall into those categories. And the mechanism is simply this. What we observe is when you have a city that's full of college graduates, and San Francisco is sort of the city on steroids in this regard, and you know, COVID is for the time being changing San Francisco, so we may have a different story in a couple of years, I don't know. But San Francisco is an incredibly high skill, well-educated city. And so it attracts other people who have college degrees. Okay, when you have, as the agglomeration of people with college degrees increase, wages increase, but they increase most among other people with the incumbents with a college degree. And the difference in income increase is heterogeneous. So it's highest at the high end of the income distribution, lowest at the low end. Now it does bring incomes up even at the low end, but here's the thing. Everybody's cost of housing goes up. And at the high end, the cost of that housing goes up by less than income. At the low end of the income distribution, the cost of that housing goes up more than that income. And so you get people unable to afford their housing in that city. And again, in San Francisco, basically all you have now are very high income people or people in subsidized housing or rent controlled housing who've been there forever. And they get pushed out. And where are they going? They're going to places like Phoenix and Las Vegas, which in part because of, in my view, land use policy, but in part because they're just not as big, and because they're not as economically productive places, are much cheaper places to go. And so in a Phoenix, you can earn less money and still have a higher standard of living because your housing is so much less expensive. And so we have been seeing this happen for, I don't know, 30 years now, this phenomenon.
Thank you for that, Richard. And I think it's helpful to have that context to understand how folks are feeling and actually experiencing that push out and how that's backed by empirical evidence. And so really appreciate your insight and context. And as we start to think about the next portion of our conversation this morning, this is the part that I'm really excited about and I think is innovative on ULI's part, and that is a focus on solutions. And so we've talked about historic discrimination, current challenges in the same regard, and now thinking about how do we shift and how do we start talking about what we can do about it today. And so I'm going to ask our next panelist to give us some examples of what we can do today. And our next panelist, whose information is in the chat with the bios, is Michael Anderson. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Effie. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here with us this morning. Could you please give us two or more examples of how transit-oriented development can support more equitable and racially just land use practices that preserve neighborhood character and historic cultural communities? And I understand that you have a few slides to share with us.
Yes, I can. And I'll start with this first slide, which are basically 4 questions that I assume most people would answer yes to, if not all of us. Next slide, please. So I have been the author of the Crenshaw LAX TOD study that was implemented by Metro prior to the Crenshaw LAX line. And the co-author of that, Farouk Amin, it was the author of the West Santa Ana Branch TOD study. And the challenge has been seeing cities have studies and vision, but how do they implement that? And most cities cannot. So we've started looking at an approach of how to create consecutive business transactions that are mutually beneficial to the city, to Metro, and to the community, to have these visions created in a shorter period of time. Now that we've been affected by COVID-19, it's also created a greater impact on Metro's ability to have revenues, even to implement the rail systems that it's proposing. And today, most of us know we have a 570,000 unit housing need today. So we're looking at having Metro, well, first let me say, there are no agreements with Metro, there are no agreements with the cities of the pilot projects. We just have consensus for them to move forward. And we have the consensus for LA County Development Authority to pay for the entitlements of these pilot projects that I'll explain. But we're looking at providing Metro with private capital in relationship with master developers to have Metro be able to acquire the land near the transit stations and beyond, and then master plan those sites and entitle it for developers to purchase the entitled properties, just like a planned community development. And for the pilot project, we have 3 to 4 stations and approximately 200 acres of land along the West Santa Ana branch corridor willing to participate in a pilot project. LA County Development Authority is interested in entitling those properties, and Metro would sell the land to developers, saving them time and money on their development projects, and then earn a profit that it can reinvest into rail and other land assembly approaches. But this process happens in a 5-year period. Thus, instead of making a transit study and having it sit there for 10 to 15 years, we actually have the village built within a 5-year period. Next slide, please. So if along the West Santa Ana branch corridor, we have 12 stations that we can implement this pilot project to assemble this land. But this creates an abundance of land for developers to build for-sale housing, workforce housing in communities around existing transit corridors. And in this case, Metro could acquire land along streets such as Vermont Boulevard from Imperial to Manchester, or around existing transit corridors throughout Los Angeles County. Next slide. But in the development of accelerated transit communities, you're going to have gentrification, or people just moving into the communities, buying up properties for redevelopment and for home ownership. We have talked about the impact of what gentrification does into communities. So we started looking at solutions for building housing for children of the community where we can preserve the culture of the community by building an accessory dwelling unit in the backyard, which is basically another house on the mother or father's property, where you use a portion of the equity to remodel mom's house and build a dwelling unit, which the kids would occupy to pay down the debt service on the loan made to improve the property and build a dwelling unit. This goes to what Richard was talking about, what Dr. Green mentioned, that it's cheaper for kids to pay a mortgage than it is to pay rent. But if we develop accessory dwelling units, we can have the kids and the parents in the same relationship on the property, which would add to the community's quality of life. The second approach that we're looking at is building duplexes and triplexes for first-time home buyers. And I've built some homes in Leimert Park for first-time home buyers using a similar model. But in this case, we're looking at have banks make amends for redlining by taking an equity position in duplex and triplexes that we build. And in this model, for example, if we were to build a triplex for $1.2 million, the bank would take a $400,000 equity position, making the buyer needing only to qualify for $800,000 loan. And with the rental income coming from the additional 2 units and the homeowner living in the other unit, their ability to finance this project allows them to have home ownership and build equity through the rental income of these units. But using this model, if we had a revolving fund of approximately $6 billion a year, we could build 20,000 triplexes throughout Los Angeles County on an annual basis with a program like this operating for 10 years. That being said, we would actually be producing 60,000 units of housing a year, thus decreasing our housing need annually. Next slide, I'm sorry. But by having the kids move back into the community and by encouraging elderly Black folks and brown folks not to sell their houses, by bringing that educated kids back home from college, we start to layer the community with their lifestyle needs, where they may have businesses opening, such as coffee shops, restaurants, and things that modernize the commercial corridors of these communities that they came from. Bringing them back brings the amenities the community is looking for, such as sit-down restaurants, beautiful streets, that start to magnify the culture by modernization of the community. This starts to make the community a destination that brings people from outside the community to come in and enjoy the culture of the community. But most importantly, it creates a better quality of life through sensible business transactions that's in everyone's mutual interest. And what's important for me and for everyone, I believe, is that the children of these low-income impacted communities can see their community transform in a way that can inspire them to become self-sustaining adults and take on the roles that you and I have today and be able to have a better quality of life. Next slide. So combining the land assembly and the home ownership approach creates what I call an economic chemistry that earns Metro money to reinvest in itself. But most importantly, we're delivering 60,000 housing units a year. Where we are right now is we have consensus. We have 3 county board of supervisors interested in this approach. We have 3 cities interested in participating. We have the LA County Development Authority interested in paying for the entitlement of the pilot sites. And we have a few Metro board members that like this idea. The other approach that I would like for us to work on as individuals is to start looking at amending the legislation around the Community Reinvestment Act to consider banks taking this equity position, because this equity position allows banks to have tangible real estate in their books, that when the property sells, they would earn that equity position benefit. And it's a way of getting communities and home ownership increase. These 2 approaches, I believe, can magnify the existing culture and eliminate the impact of gentrification, of people moving out of the community, but it also grows the city's tax base. And most importantly for us as Los Angeles getting ready for the 28 by 28 Olympics, we've created solutions that help solve most of the challenges. And I'll stop there, and Effie, I hope that creates some ideas for discussion. And thank you.
Thank you for that. It does. It does. And I think this idea about wealth building and generational wealth is really really important. And is, as we think about the use in the past of eminent domain to take viable property which and valuable property which occurred in Los Angeles in many instances, including some very public examples like what happened to the Latinx community in Chavez Ravine, where Dodger Stadium was eventually cited, and also at Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach, where the city took private property of an African American family intended allegedly for public use, but took a long time before they turned it into a park, and questionable fair market value compensation. It happened also, this concept of eminent domain happened where wealth building and intergenerational wealth was not possible in East Side communities with the freeways crisscrossing those communities. Again, those points of least resistance. And now thinking about finding solutions for wealth building, and your innovative work is really incredible. And I think it's going to have to be the way that we move if we're going to be able to catch up, as Richard mentioned previously, in this 200-year race where we're 200 years behind catching up on the wealth gap. And so your examples were very helpful, and I think things that we can build on in future conversations. So thank you. And the next speaker that we're going to be engaging is Rudy Espinosa, and I'm really looking forward to this dialogue with him. We have had a number of discussions around issues of inequality, historic marginalization, and those areas. But what's really refreshing about what Rudy does is that he, like Michael, is actively putting together projects to assist communities that have been left out and undervalued, but demonstrate a tremendous amount of entrepreneurial spirit and know-how. And he is helping make a difference in Los Angeles and bringing these projects to fruition. Rudy, as the executive director of Inclusive Action, your organization's stated mission is to bring people together and to build strong local economies that uplift low-income urban communities. Good morning, Rudy. How are you?
I'm doing all right, Effie. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for being with us. My question for you is, if we think about advocacy and transformation through economic development initiatives, could you share with us 2 examples of your current work and maybe some opportunities you see for developing wealth building opportunities for entrepreneurs of color and communities of color, both in the small business and or land use sectors?
Yeah, totally. Cerise, do we have, did my slides get into the deck? If not, don't worry about it.
They did. We're going to have to pull them up in another format. We're having technical difficulties.
Okay. Well, you don't have to worry about it, Cerise. It's all good. I could run them through by memory. There were only a few short slides. But I do want to say, Effie, that I'm really inspired by the other speakers here, just because it's really important. The history, that Richard gave us and the data that Paul presented is really important, because I've been finding more and more that when we speak about the past of our city and our country, we realize that the past is the present, that these issues are still here, and they're actually even more prevalent. And I'm super inspired, and I'm honored to go after Michael, because Michael, I'm just like, dude, this guy is amazing. What? Like, the innovation in the prototyping that's taking place is exactly what I think we need to develop in our field if we really want to address some of the land use issues that we're seeing. Oh, thank you so much, Cerise. VIP star for you. So Effie, you already mentioned a little bit of what Inclusive Action does, but for folks that are not familiar with our organization, we are a nonprofit CDFI based here in Los Angeles. We were created about 12 years ago with my dear friend Alfred and many other superheroes in the city, Alfred Freihoff, who's an attorney, a land use attorney. And we created this organization back in the day, really as a laboratory for community development. We really wanted to think differently. We saw that we needed to really prototype new solutions to change the course of some of the communities that we were working in. And there's two major things that we do at Inclusive Action. The first thing that we do is we generate policy research so we can advocate. We think that the conditions in our communities are such because there was intentional policy, just like Richard shared with us, that have created these conditions. It's no accident that that Black and Brown communities are struggling a great deal as compared to their white counterparts. Those were intentional policies that created these conditions. And so we believe that we need to really work, generate research, put together data, and inform our elected officials on how we can change these systems. But the second thing that we do at Inclusive Action is we design economic development initiatives. We think that policy is not enough. We need to work to change the laws, as Michael was suggesting in his presentation, but we also have to think about how capital moves in neighborhoods or how it doesn't move, as our history tells us. So, you know, it's really about systems change in capital. That's what we focus on at Inclusive Action. So let's go to the next slide, Cerise. So on the policy side, one of the initiatives that many folks know us, one of the highest profile ones, is the effort to legalize street vending. We started, this is one of our first initiatives at the organization. We worked and formed a coalition because we saw that LA was one of the only major cities in the country that didn't have a permit system for sidewalk vendors. And so for me, as an urban planner and as a lover of cities, I see the issue with street vendors as a microcosm, as an example of how we treat Black and Brown entrepreneurs, how land use policies hurt Black and Brown entrepreneurs, and how they're criminalized. Street vendors, it's unjust in our opinion that vendors are being criminalized because they're trying to take care of their families because the formal economy doesn't have a place for them. And so next slide, please. The LA Street Vendor Campaign was formed to address this issue and to make sure that our city had a regulatory system for sidewalk vendors. And we've been working on it. We still are working on it. But you know, one of the key things that informed our policy work, it always does, is that community members inform every single step of the work. So over the 10 years or so of this campaign, street vendors, and this is a photo of one of the city hall hearings, street vendors informed every proposal that we advanced in city council. Every time there was an idea, it was informed by street vendor work groups. And I had a map of that showed you. I'm happy to send it to anybody that's interested. That showed the different work groups all over the city and how we make decisions within the campaign. But one of the things when we think about advocacy and systems change is we want to make sure that community members are at the forefront of those because they are the experts. They know their community better than anybody. And so as a result of this effort, we've had a variety of different milestone wins. It started with in 2013 when the motion was first introduced. That took us all the way to 2018 when we passed a statewide policy, Senate Bill 946, that decriminalized street vending throughout the state of California. And then that led to the city finally legalizing street vending in 2018. And there's still, you know, some hiccups, big props to Streets LA and the department, the other departments in the city that are trying to work through the implementation of this policy. But the good thing is that the city is on its way. And just recently, this is like 2 weeks ago, friends, the county board of supervisors also created their own regulatory framework or began their process to create the regulatory framework. And they invested, which I think is the first time ever, invested $1 million in a pilot program to develop affordable carts for food vendors, because that's one of the major obstacles that street vendors face when they're trying to formalize. So this is just one example I wanted to share, folks, of community-informed policy change. And there's still much more work to go. Thank you, Cerise. So we think, I was really struck by the words "the path forward" in the title of this discussion with everybody. And I think that the path forward requires us not only to think about systems change, but also to think about the distribution of capital. A study that I often cite that came out of UCLA a few years ago cites that the median net worth of Black and brown households is, as compared to white, is very different. The median net worth of a white household in Los Angeles is $355,000, but the Mexican household has a median net worth of $4,000, and the Black household has a median net worth of $3,500. So it's basically Black and brown people have about 1% of the net worth of white households here in LA, in our city. And so if we really want to think about an equitable future, we really need to think about how this capital is distributed. Next slide, Cerise. So I'm going to share with everybody, just to close, 2 case studies quickly on how we're thinking about how capital is distributed. Now, again, I want to emphasize that these projects are informed by the political work, by the organizing work that we do with our partners, by the voices of street vendors, for example, and other low-income families. So the first case study that I'll share with you is our microloan fund called the Semilla Fund. This fund was directly informed by the street vendors. When we were advocating at City Hall, they were saying, Rudy, if we ever win, how will we be able to afford the equipment that's going to be required of us? No one's going to lend to us. We have no credit. As Richard was telling us, we have limited collateral and assets. What bank is going to underwrite a loan for us? And they were right. After looking into it, I was like, wow, dude, they're totally right. There are even some of the micro lenders, our colleagues out here, don't have a product for them. So we created a loan fund that was designed to support entrepreneurs like the ones that are pictured here, one of our clients. And so these are character-based loans. The underwriting prioritizes equity. And every single time we provide capital, we also provide business coaching. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, we're a CDFI certified organization now. We've deployed over $500,000 in microloans in a short time. We're probably going to get out another $250,000 by the end of the year. And we're also, during this pandemic, I'm not going to get into what's happening with the relief efforts, but we're also doing work with the county. The county has capital to support small businesses, and we're working with them, with our partners in the county, to try to get capital to businesses using our underwriting systems, character-based loans, not telling people that they don't qualify, saying, how do we get you how do we get you to qualify? What's a healthy amount of debt that you can take on during this pandemic so we could get through this together? And of course, the magic of the loan fund is that every single time we underwrite a loan and we get capital to someone, we're with that client for the term of the loan. We're with them providing business coaching and assistance, so they know that we are standing side by side with them in solidarity, that this is not simply of us just deploying capital and getting out of the way. We're saying we're going to have your back, and that's really key. Next slide, please. The second case study that I wanted to share with you is an outgrowth of our lending work with small businesses. One of the things that we saw 2016, 2017 is we thought, man, we're seeing that small businesses are really struggling with commercial real estate in neighborhoods that are changing. Sometimes the first stakeholders to leave a neighborhood when a wave of gentrification is coming is small businesses. There isn't any rent control, as I'm sure a lot of you all know. There isn't any rent control for commercial real estate. So if you don't have a lease, your landlord could bump up the rent as much as they want. Even here in my neighborhood in Highland Park, I was seeing businesses that from one month to the next, the rents was doubling and tripling. and they have to leave if they can't pay the rent. So we at Inclusive Action ended up started to think about what do we do to address this. In the solution, the prototype is, how do we acquire commercial real estate in a collaborative way in order to preserve small businesses in our neighborhoods? And so Inclusive Action partnered with Little Tokyo Service Center and East LA Community Corporation. And what we did is we basically huddled up and we said, let's raise money together. Let's figure out how we could take properties off the speculative market. Let's buy some buildings, and let's preserve all those businesses that are within these buildings. If there's a vacant building, for example, like this one that's pictured here, let's do some tenant improvement and let's get some small businesses in here that could use it, that are from the neighborhood, and they could have some security that they're not going to be pushed out. And what's more, this project also seeks to, over time, include the tenants into the ownership group. So one of the things that we're going to be doing is working with tenants to build their capacity to be owners. And the cool thing about this project with our finance partner in Genesis LA, who has been a tremendous ally in getting capital and being with us every single step of the way, we last year acquired 5 buildings on the east side. And, this is a crazy time in a pandemic to be a property owner, as maybe I'm sure some of you can relate. But, we believe that this is part of the future. The future is going to, it must include land and property that's owned by community members and users on that land. So I'll stop there, Effie. I hope that gave you an overview and gave you some examples of what I think are exciting things for the future.
Thank you, Rudy. It definitely did give a lot of food for thought. I know we are going to be moving soon into the question and answer portion of our program this morning, but I just wanted to follow up on some conversations that you and I have had around thinking about return on investment. And you can choose to answer this now, or we can come back to you, but just thinking about return on investment as a societal value, and thinking about it not just in terms of dollars and cents, in terms of a cash return on investment, and thinking about how we start addressing these wealth gap issues and issues of inequality. And can you maybe talk to us a little bit about that idea of how can we think about measuring or looking at return on investment differently to build a more inclusive Los Angeles?
Yeah, Effie, thank you so much for this question. I mean, I think that our field, and the field that I'm talking about, I'm calling generally community development, is lacking a ton of creativity. Because when we think about return, we think about it and define it so narrowly. And the future requires us to think bigger and more expansively about what return means. Return cannot mean simply how much money is the investor going to get back, which is how I see it defined all the time. When someone asks me, what is the ROI in the loan fund? They're only asking usually, how much money am I going to get back? And that narrow thinking is hurting us. It's even hurting the investor in the long term, in my opinion. And, in our loan fund, for example, we are always trying to cut the interest rate for our borrowers. We're rolling out a new loan product that's really designed to support businesses during this time. And it's going to have, I think the interest rate right now has dropped to 3%, and it's going to have no payments for the first 6 months, 12 months. It forces us to get creative about how we're going to make it work. But the intention is to support people. The intention is not to make money. And so I really struggle at times, Effie, when, I struggle with like, oh, well, we need to figure out how to get the investors to, the investors are not going to play if they don't make a lot of money. And I'm just like, why? We need to push them a little harder, So I guess that's my initial response to that question. I mean, the last thing that I'll share with you, Effie, is this morning before the panel, I read the paper every day, and then in the New York Times, I don't know if anybody read it. And I'm not trying to get political. This is just an example. There's an article said, I think it's titled like "The Secret Trump Voter," and it was a profile of a person, and the person said is voting for Trump, And they said, well, I know that he's really complicated and there's a lot of issues, but my 401k is doing really well. And they listed all these financial issues. So it doesn't matter that the world is ending. What matters is that their return is very narrowly defined, and it's about, oh, is my mutual fund doing okay? And I think that is so narrow-minded. And so as a field, we really need to think a little bit broader about what else is a return, Effie. Does it matter that people are getting paid well? Does it matter that we don't have, it doesn't matter to us that people are on the street, don't have a place to go? Does it matter that our kids don't have childcare? I think that these things have to be included in our equations.
Thank you, Rudy, for that. I couldn't agree with you more, and thinking about, and I think, it's not that the idea is not to not have a return on investment, but the potential for a slightly lesser return potentially for tremendous gains that could impact the overall economy and well-being of the community.
Effie, can I just put an exclamation point on that? Because when I talk about this, everybody says, well, Rudy, are you saying that we shouldn't make any money? I'm not saying that. I'm a lover of the economy, so I think it's okay if you earn, I'm just saying to think broader about what are the other things that matter to us. That's it. So I just want to put an exclamation point for all the, folks here in the crowd, some people, that might be like, Rudy's tripping. I'm just saying, guys, we have to think a little bit broader.
Thank you, Rudy. So this now brings us to the question and answer portion of our program. And I have received a number of questions in the chat. Unfortunately, I'm only able to see the chat that comes to me privately. So if you have questions, if you could please submit them to me privately in the chat rather than to everyone, as we're having some technical difficulties with the chat. The first question, I think, nicely dovetails with Rudy's conversation and opening it up to all of the panelists. The question is, what are some strategies that private market rate developers can implement today to mitigate some of the harm that has been caused by historical racism at the policy level? Does anyone want to take that?
Well, one of the things, two things. One is start employing some people and putting them in, if not immediate decision maker power, that they have access to the decision makers in the company. And when you saw the CEO of Wells Fargo talk about there are not qualified people of color, and I'm thinking, well, your white guys at Wells Fargo haven't done all that well over the last, 10, 15 years, something like that. So surely you can find people of color who have done at least that well. Educating, I almost hate using that word because it sounds so condescending, but making people aware of investment opportunities that are good investment opportunities that just doesn't occur to them because they don't even, they can't get their brains around the fact that there are communities where people are really good at paying their rent and people want to be homeowners and so on. And so they go to the same old places over and over again, unless they're getting a subsidy. And I think there are lots of opportunities for people to make money in neighborhoods where they don't know that they can make money. And if you have people who are from those neighborhoods as part of these companies, and again, in at least having access to the decision makers of the companies and ultimately becoming decision makers, I think that could make a difference. But we don't see that sort of sea change in hiring yet that I think we really need to see.
I think, Richard, that's a great answer. I would like to expand on that. One of the things we should think about if we're concerned about systemic inequality or systemic racism is that it does not just occur in one arena. It's just not a housing phenomenon. It's a broader phenomenon that feeds into each other. And we should be concerned about the labor market and how that's creating inequality during the pandemic, and how the hardship is disproportionately falling on renters of colors, homeowners of color. We should be concerned not about today, but also about the future in terms of the educational system. The housing market is deeply embedded within our unequal educational system. And so we need to think about not just getting people into homes. We need to think, how do we get them into neighborhoods that offer their children opportunities? And so I guess the bottom line is that it is very useful to think about this in a much more comprehensive, expanded way. And that means reaching out beyond the silo of just housing.
If I'd like to add on what Richard and Paul are saying is that I remember in the 80s, there was a program in Boston called KBB, which meant Kids Building Boston. And at that time, kids from the neighborhoods that were being redeveloped were hired by the lawyers, the architects to work in their offices so they could get exposure to what those jobs were. Another idea that we were looking at is have alley beautification projects in Los Angeles where kids help improve alley landscape by cleaning them up, painting garages and things. And using that fund programs such as Youth at Risk to start to employ kids, pay them $15 an hour, and then beautify an alley, put remote control gates at the end for the homeowners, but then transform the alley into an outdoor play area for the kids where the garages back up to the alley. But then this way they take ownership of the beautification that they've done to the community they live in. And we looked at that in terms of how that stimulates kids to become responsible and want to seek employment. It was something we were successful in Leimert Park.
Thank you. Michael, we have a specific question for you. The question is, how do we ensure that communities are engaged and provided with agency throughout this decision-making process?
So when we did the Crenshaw LAX study, it was interesting because we had communities, each community, Hyde Park, Leimert Park, all were engaged in creating the vision for that community. And that's important because when they create that vision, then they are aware, tell you which land they would like to be transformed into a different use. During that process, you also start to see opportunities of where you can employ young men and women from the community to work on those development projects when they're built. And so that's an approach that I believe is keeping the community involved and then them participating in the transformation. That gives them confidence because in the past, we've done these studies, everybody's excited, but then when it's over, you're waiting for this vision to become manifested into a tangible project, and it doesn't happen in the way that they've envisioned it or we told them it could have. Does that answer the question?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Michael. We have about 12 minutes remaining in the program, so I'm going to ask that in response to the questions that the panelists try and be brief, and also to invite everyone to now turn on their cameras if they're able to. Michael, this is another question for you. The question is, I wanted to ask Michael about the structure of the financing for the triplex, fourplex that he proposed. Which party is going to take the equity that lowers the overall loan? Does this have unintended consequences of simply pushing property prices up further?
The party to take ownership of the equity position would be banks and insurance companies. It kind of replicates a model in the 50s when in New York, insurance companies were required to build housing. We looked at that approach in terms of how can that be applied to create ownership. It would be a requirement under the Community Reinvestment Act. The bank doesn't collect on the $400,000. It sits there as an equity position. And it's also an investment into the community. So that's the approach that we're looking at. And I forgot the second part of your question.
The second part is, does this have the unintended consequence of simply pushing up property prices further?
I'm not sure. I haven't studied it. But we do want property to appreciate, but we also want to make sure the people that are retired that own the homes, especially in South Central Los Angeles, where some people bought the homes 30, 40 years ago, they don't sell the property and move out of the community, because I believe they're protected by Prop 13 from having property taxes increase. Then in addition, if they do an accessory dwelling units and bring their kids to the community, that layers to the quality of life. And we do want an appreciation in value. We just don't want it to be detrimental to the homeowner.
Yes, thank you. Another question. The question is, I work for a large architecture firm that has signed on to LA's NOMA commitment. How can we partner with some of the organizations and efforts mentioned in this talk?
That question is for?
Maybe for Rudy.
And they're working on what project, Effie?
The question is it's LANOMA. I'm not sure what NOMA stands for.
Oh, NOMA, National Organization of Minority Architects. Is that true? I think.
That sounds right.
Yes.
Well, Michael might help me then with this answer, I guess. I mean, I love working with, you know, in a past life, I worked with banks in sort of seeking double bottom line partnerships. And I think that, I think there's a lot of value for folks working together. And so if there was an organization that wanted to work with us or anybody else, I always sort of look for, you know, some shared value. Like, is there some mission alignment? You know, is there an existing program that they could jump in on, or maybe there's an opportunity to create something different? You know, I think I just want to kind of go back to my initial comments, which, you know, Michael's project is really interesting because it's creating something different. I don't believe the tools that we have right now are the ones that are going to get us to the future, you know? And so we need to create.
And to expand on what Rudy is saying, I think we have a need, which is increased home ownership, and we have a housing need in the market. The solution that benefits everybody is to make the production of home ownership by building housing and make it easy for owners to acquire the house without the risk. When we have a 570,000 unit need, and we start to come up with a method of producing 20,000 duplexes and triplexes as a potential solution, we are setting in the process of production, of job creation, and investment, payments of permits, things that can catalyze our local market economy in a way while providing solutions. And in the past, it happens in the private sector investing into what I call star cities. Money follows money. So the concept is to make investment go where money is not already going. And this is what the CEO of Metro talks about, how to get Metro to influence investment into other areas. And I think if we take it as a production approach, we can create the jobs and start solving a majority of the problems that need to be addressed, from hiring young men and women in the communities, and do it over a 10-year period where the kids can grow and say, I want to be that CPA, or I want to be that architect. I want to be the framer. But I think we have the need and we can make the solution. So I think it's a matter of how do we make it into production. We have a lot of architects that want to do the work here.
Thank you for that. There's also, we have a number of questions remaining, but I do see we are at 8:54. I think some folks are having some challenges turning on their video just to the organizers for today. And so I wanted to turn back to Cerise to see if we have time for a couple of more questions, or if we need to pause here and maybe pick these questions up later, forward them to the panelists for them to answer individually at a later time.
Oh, of course. We can take a couple of extra questions. Effie, sure, go ahead.
Okay, great. So there's a, let's see, there is a question around Dr. Green's position with respect to folks leaving areas. And it said, for Richard, what are Richard's data that let him know the actual reasons motivating people who leave cities that he has listed? Any chance that someone might prefer to live in Phoenix than, say, South Los Angeles or San Francisco? Again, what are the data for his conclusion?
Okay, that's a great question. And the honest answer is, can I really nail down the motivations of people? No. Can I observe what they have in common when they leave? Yes. So that's the data we use is a data set called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, and we combine that with the American Community Survey, which allows us to follow about 10,000 households over time. And so you can see how things like the cost of housing, at what are their threshold points at which we see people move, because housing relative to income is cheaper in one place than another place. And so, yes, we cannot really know what's in people's heads, but we can observe very regular patterns among these groups of people. And the patterns are overwhelmingly regular. Is that you see when people with college degrees move into cities, the people who are the incumbents in the cities with college degrees see their incomes go up higher than others, whereas whereas the cost of their housing goes up, but not by as much as others. And then you observe the people who have less educational attainment move to these other places. And so that's how we are drawing these inferences. But if you were an econometrician and you wanted to claim we had not nailed down causation, I would have to agree with you.
I would, if you're interested in particularly the African American community here in Los Angeles, I recommend you might want to look at in terms of why people moved out. One is a very extensive ethnographic and quantitative study by Professor Pfeiffer at ASU. She did extensive studies of the movements from South Los Angeles into other areas. The other one was about a year ago, the city council district in that area did a survey during one of the major events that drew people into that community for a festival. And there was a survey done in terms of trying to ask people, why did you move out and what would it take to bring you back in?
So what did they find, Paul?
The reason they move out is education, safety, those popped out as top things. Cost of living, lots of them moved, for example, not away from the region, but into the Inland Empire.
Yeah.
And so it's a combination of things. The interesting thing is, what would bring them back? It's the same sort of issues that they have that led them to move away. The big attraction is that the social networks that they want to maintain. And it's a hard decision. So many of the people who moved out still had strong attachments to community institutions, to relatives and friends, but it's a hard choice. It's a hard choice because we manufacture many of these problems in terms of public safety, policing, issues of poor schools, and so forth.
And Dr. Ong, thank you for that. And I think that folks can refer to those that study, and maybe we can share this afterwards. I do see that we are at time. It is 8:59, and the last question is, what is the ask for ULI members to move the needle forward in equity, for housing and in job creation. I would like to have someone close us out there, but I want to turn back to Cerise to see if there are any housekeeping matters that we need to handle before having someone close us out with about a 1-minute explanation or response to that question.
We are good, with apologies to all who could not get on camera because of the technical issues, but I think we are ready to have that final question answered. Thank you, Effie.
Great. And so the question, and I know Dr. Ong has got to depart right this moment, but again, what from each of the panelists, if maybe we could have a 30-second response if possible, what would you do? What is your ask of those who are participating today to help to move the needle forward to create a more equitable Los Angeles in terms of housing and job creation, and if you want to address wealth gap, that's fine as well. I'm going to turn to Dr. Ong first to see if he's still with us to give his response.
I think the biggest thing is that we will have to prepare for a wave of housing crises that's going to happen next year. And people are doing great work, but the market forces and the dynamics is creating huge problems in both the rental and owner market. And we need to understand the nature of that problem, the magnitude of it, and then start thinking creatively about how do we address that when that happens over the next year during the recovery. We need to do that to have a just recovery. And thank you, everyone. I apologize for having to leave.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. And turning to Michael, do you want to give the folks on the call today some pearls of wisdom of how they can help move us forward?
I think our mission should be to increase home ownership as a majority of the population owning homes. If you look at Singapore, it has a 91% home ownership rate. They started in 1964 focusing on that because they knew the benefits of stabilizing communities. They also focused on designing communities that weren't based on a majority of one culture. And that way they melted in diversity and religion. And today that has seemed very successful in how they've done that. And I think we should consider that approach because that's what makes people move away from Los Angeles. It's the challenge in affording a house.
Thank you, Michael. Dr. Green?
Two quick things. One is think about hiring people who you hadn't thought about hiring before. And number two is from a thing ULI specifically can do is raise awareness. It amazes me when I show people a redlining map that the vast majority of them had no idea that such a thing ever existed, that it was codified in the federal government, that it was difficult for people of color to get access to homeownership. And I think that will make people understand the urgency and depth of this problem.
Thank you. Oops. Having a little challenge there. There we go. Thank you, Dr. Green. And Rudy, can you close us out?
Yes, I love the Singapore example, Michael. We have to kick it when this is all over. Singapore is an amazing example, Effie, because Singapore has strong policies that made that a priority. So if we really want to change the way things work, we have to all work together to change the systems that are creating these conditions. But the last thing that I'll share with everybody is that I'd love for all of us to really push ourselves to see how we're interconnected. And it may make us feel really uncomfortable, but I'm down. We got to be down for the hard conversations together because that's the only way we can get through all this stuff. So let's look for the connections.
Thank you, Rudy, and thank you everyone for joining the call. I'm going to turn it back over to Cerise to give us our final farewell and entry into the morning.
All so much. We really appreciate this panel and all that they have, their time and efforts to pull this together. ULI really believes that this is an important thing for people to understand where we came from, the historic context, and the many ways in which people are being creative about finding solutions. Effie, thank you so much. Rudy, Paul, Richard, Michael, and thank you all for being with us on behalf of ULI Los Angeles. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.